The wind did not howl. It was a physical presence, a solid thing that pressed against the world with the weight of frozen gods. Outside, the temperature had been 42 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit for 3 days. With the wind, the trappers who still dared to speak of such things claimed it was closer to 90 below. The air was so cold it was crystalline, a fine, glittering dust of ice that scoured any exposed skin raw in seconds. In the scattered cabins of the high valley, this was a killing cold. It was a cold that found every chink in the mud and moss chinking of log walls, a cold that turned window panes to opaque sheets of thick frost, a cold that made the very timber of the structures groan and crack in protest. Inside those cabins, men and women huddled around roaring, ravenous fires that consumed wood at an impossible rate, yet failed to push the chill back more than a few feet. The heat went straight up the chimney, pulling the precious warm air with it, while the drafts that snaked across the floor were like icy serpents. In his stout, double-walled cabin, Thomas Blackwood, a man who had built 4 such structures in his life and considered himself an authority, swore as another gust of wind forced a puff of acrid smoke back down his stone chimney. The air in the room, 6 feet from a fire that should have been roasting, was a mere 20 degrees. His wife and 2 small children were buried under every blanket and pelt they owned, their breath pluming in the still air of their own bed. The walls were not just cold to the touch. They were covered in a layer of feathery ice. They were freezing slowly and inexorably inside a structure that represented the pinnacle of conventional wisdom. 14 miles away, built into the sheer granite face of what the old prospectors called the Widow's Tooth, a different reality existed. Here there was no sound of wind. There was only a profound, stone-deep silence. Inside a space that was half cave, half cabin, Anya sat at a simple wooden table, her father's engineering diagram spread before her. She was 16 years old. A large, shaggy dog, a mix of wolf and something hardier, lay sleeping on the floor, not near the source of heat, but simply in the middle of the room. He did not need to huddle. The air was a stable, even 70 degrees. There were no drafts. The single pane of glass in her small, deep-set window was perfectly clear, offering a view of a world gone mad with white. A kettle of water on the flat top of the massive masonry structure that dominated the far wall let out a gentle hiss. Anya had lit a fire that morning, a fast, hot fire that had burned for 90 minutes. She would not need to light another until the next day. The heat was not a frantic, temporary thing. It was a presence, a quality of the very stone and clay she lived within, a deep, radiant warmth that emanated from the 8-ton mass of the Russian stove she had built with her own hands. While the valley's strongest men were losing their battle with the cold, the orphan girl they had mocked was living in a pocket of summer. Before we learn how a 16-year-old girl accomplished what experienced builders could not, let us know in the comments where you are watching this story from, in what corner of the world you find yourself. And if tales of ingenuity and the quiet triumph of the underestimated are what you seek, consider subscribing to this channel. The line between folly and genius is often drawn by the unforgiving hand of survival. It had all begun with a death. The previous winter had been cruel, but not historically so. It was a standard Montana winter, which was to say, a season intent on killing anything unprepared. Anya's father, Lars Eriksson, had not been unprepared. He had simply been unlucky and, in the end, conventional. He was a mining engineer, a man of calculations and geological certainties, but the cabin he had bought was a standard trapper's build, single-wall logs, hastily chinked, with a large, handsome, and tragically inefficient fieldstone fireplace. Lars understood the principles of heat transfer and thermodynamics on a technical level. He knew the fireplace was a fraud, sending 80% of its heat straight up the flue and using the draft to pull cold air into the cabin through 100 hidden gaps. He had plans, grand plans, sketched out in his notebooks for a better way. But the demands of establishing a homestead, of clearing land and securing food for the winter, had pushed his engineering projects to the back of his mind. He would improve the cabin next year, he'd told Anya. For now, they would make do. Making do meant a constant, exhausting battle for warmth. It meant feeding the fire a quarter of a cord of wood every day, only to have the cabin's temperature plummet to near freezing the moment it died down. It meant waking up to a skin of ice on the water bucket, just feet from the hearth. In late January, a week of relentless damp cold settled in. It wasn't the spectacular cold of a blizzard, but a penetrating chill that clung to clothes and settled deep in the lungs. Lars, exhausted from felling and bucking trees in the wet snow, caught a cough. The cough deepened. The drafts in the cabin gave it nowhere to hide. He spent his days shivering in a chair pulled so close to the fire his clothes smelled of scorch. Yet his back remained chilled. The cough became pneumonia. Anja watched, helpless as the man who could calculate the stresses on a tunnel timber 1,000 feet underground was defeated by a simple draft across a wooden floor. He died in early February, his last breaths forming ghost-like clouds in the frigid air of the room. The fire in the hearth blazed uselessly. The community, such as it was, responded with a clumsy but genuine sympathy. Thomas Blackwood, the unofficial leader of the half-dozen families in the valley, organized 2 men to help Anya bury her father in the frozen ground. Afterward, they gathered in her cold, silent cabin, their faces grim. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose kindness was always tinged with anxiety, wrung her hands. "A child can't be left alone out here," she murmured. "It's not right." Blackwood nodded, his expression one of solemn authority. He was a large man accustomed to his voice being the final word. "Anya," he began, his tone gentle but firm, "your father was a good man, but this is no place for you now. In the spring, when the pass is clear, I'll take you to Fort Benton myself. You can find a family there, someone to take you in." He looked around the cabin, at the pathetic fireplace, the frosty walls. "This life, it's too hard for a man alone, let alone—" He trailed off, but his meaning was clear, let alone a girl. Anya said nothing. She listened as they spoke about her, as if she were a piece of freight to be moved, a problem to be solved. They talked of practicality, of safety, of propriety. They saw a grieving, helpless child. They did not see the quiet furnace of her father's lessons burning inside her. They did not see the methodical mind that had absorbed his talk of geology, of heat sinks, of the Earth's insulating properties. They saw a tragedy. She saw a failure of engineering. Her father had not died from winter. He had died from a poorly designed box that could not hold heat. The cold was a constant. The variable was the shelter. And that, she decided in the profound silence after they had left, was a variable she could solve. When Blackwood returned a week later to check on her, bringing a small sack of flour and some salted meat, He asked again about her plans. She had been busy. She had not been grieving, at least not in the way they expected. She had been studying. Her father's notebooks were filled with his precise angular script, with diagrams and calculations. There were geological surveys of the valley, notes on rock strata, and thermal conductivity charts. And there, on 5 consecutive pages, was a detailed study of Russian and German masonry heaters. He had sketched cross-sections, calculated flue gas pathways, and estimated the thermal mass required to heat a 1,500 cubic foot space for 24 hours on a single burn. He'd even noted a local source of high-quality clay and the type of sand needed for the mortar. It was all there, a blueprint for survival. "I'm staying," she told Blackwood. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Anya, be reasonable. You're a child. You cannot manage a homestead, chop the wood, hunt. I'm not going to manage this homestead," she interrupted, gesturing at the cabin around them. "I'm going to abandon it. I'm going to build a new one." A flicker of interest crossed his face. "Oh? Where?" "In the side of the Widow's Tooth. There is a shallow cave on the south-facing cliff, about 40 feet up from the base. The rock is stable granite. It will be the back and side walls." Blackwood stared at her. The interest vanished, replaced by disbelief, then a kind of pitying condescension. "You want to live in a cave? Like an animal?" "Not in a cave," she corrected him patiently. "I will build a timber frame front wall to enclose the opening. The rock itself will be my insulation and my thermal mass. The earth behind it maintains a constant temperature of about 50 degrees year-round. It's a heat sink in summer and a heat source in winter. I will build a Russian fireplace against the back wall. Its mass will store and radiate the heat into the sealed space." He looked at her as if she had started speaking in tongues. He was a man of logs and axes, of methods tested and proven by generations of men like him. He knew what worked. 4 walls and a big fire. What she was describing sounded like madness, the ramblings of a grief-stricken girl. "A Russian? What? Anya, that's nonsense. You need a proper cabin, on the ground. We can help you build a small one if you're determined to stay, though I advise against it." "A proper cabin almost killed my father," she said, her voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper. "A proper cabin lets the heat escape and the cold enter. Your proper cabins are fighting the winter. I'm going to join with the mountain." The conversation was over. Blackwood left, shaking his head. The story spread through the small community like a slow contagion. The poor Erickson girl. Grief has touched her mind. She thinks she's a mining engineer like her father. The men would stop by her father's old claim, watching from a distance as spring arrived and she began her work. They saw a slip of a girl, barely 100 pounds, using a block and tackle her father had left behind to haul buckets of clay and sand up a steep scree slope to the mouth of the cave she had chosen. They saw her painstakingly clearing the floor of the shallow overhang, leveling it with gravel and packed earth. Silas, an old trapper who rarely spoke, watched her one afternoon for a full hour as she used a rock hammer to chip away at a protrusion near the back wall, her movements economical and precise. He didn't mock her. He just watched, his face unreadable. But others were not so circumspect. "She's digging her own tomb," one man, a hunter named Jed, remarked to Blackwood. "She'll be sealed in there by the first big snow. If the whole thing doesn't collapse on her first, Blackwood just grunted. She'll learn. Winter teaches harsh lessons. It's a shame, but she won't listen to reason. The consensus was that it was a tragedy in the making, and they were the helpless audience. The work was immense, a Sisyphean task for a grown man, let alone a girl. Her days took on a relentless rhythm, dictated by sunlight and muscle. First came the foundation for the stove. Her father's notes were explicit. A 6 by 4 foot pit, 2 feet deep, filled with compacted gravel and large flat stones to create a stable insulated base that wouldn't heave in the frost. She dug it with a shovel and a pick, her hands blistering, then healing into thick calluses. Her dog, Bjorn, lay at the cave mouth, a silent, watchful guardian, occasionally nudging her hand with his wet nose as if to offer encouragement. Then came the stove itself, the heart of her new world. This was not a simple fireplace. It was a complex piece of thermal engineering. She mixed the mortar herself in a wooden trough. 1 part clay, 2 parts sharp sand, enough water to make a thick, workable paste. The inner core, the firebox, and the start of the flue system required fire bricks. Her father had a small, precious pallet of them, saved for a project just like this. She laid them with painstaking care, her fingers tracing the diagrams in the notebook. The design was counterintuitive. The goal was not to let the smoke escape easily. The goal was to trap it, to force the hot gases on a long, tortuous journey through a labyrinth of channels within the stove's mass before they were allowed to exit. She built the firebox, a small, heavily reinforced chamber designed for a rapid, intensely hot burn. From its top, the flue did not go straight up. It went sideways, then down, then up again, then sideways, snaking through the growing mass of the stove in a series of 5 passes. Each pass was a chamber, separated by a baffle of brick and stone. The hot gases would swirl in these chambers, transferring their energy to the masonry before being drawn into the next pass. Only at the very end, cooled to a fraction of their initial temperature, would the gases be vented into a simple chimney pipe that went straight up through the roof she had yet to build. It was slow, brutal work. She had to quarry the stone for the outer shell herself from the talus slope below, using wedges and a sledgehammer to split larger rocks. She would then haul the pieces, some weighing 50 or 60 pounds, up the slope on a crude stone boat she'd fashioned. Each stone was set in the thick clay mortar, encasing the inner brickwork, building the mass. The men who watched from afar saw her day after day, a small figure covered in dust and clay wrestling with stones, and they shook their heads. It was unnatural. This was not work for a girl. It was work for a team of oxen and 3 strong men. By midsummer, the stove was a hulking beast of stone and clay, 8 feet tall, 6 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. It stood against the solid granite of the back wall of the cave, a man-made monolith inside a natural one. It was ugly, functional, and to Anya, beautiful. It was a battery designed to be charged with fire and to discharge life-giving heat. While she worked on the stove, she also had to prepare the timber. There was a stand of lodgepole pine a quarter-mile away. Her father had taught her how to use a 2-man cross-cut saw by herself, a slow, exhausting process of rocking the blade back and forth, letting its weight do the work. She felled 10 straight, tall pines, each about 10 inches in diameter. The sound of the saw was a lonely rhythm in the vast silence of the mountains. Limbing them with an axe was easier, but still draining. The real challenge was moving them. She couldn't lift a 20-foot log. Here, her father's engineering mind came to her rescue. She used leverage, fulcrums, and rollers. She used the gentle downward slope of the land to her advantage. With Bjorn sometimes pulling on a rope to help guide the front end, she painstakingly moved each log from the forest to the base of the cliff. Getting them up to the cave mouth was another problem altogether. She solved it with the block and tackle, a system of ropes and pulleys that multiplied her strength. Anchoring the tackle to a sturdy outcrop of rock above the cave, she would hoist one end of a log at a time, a few feet with each pull, then secure it and repeat. It took a full week to get all 10 logs up to her building site. The men in the valley noted her progress with a kind of morbid curiosity. "She got the logs up," Jed admitted to Blackwood one day. "I'll give her that, but she'll never raise a wall by herself." He was almost right. Notching the logs for the front wall was a skill she had practiced with her father on smaller projects. She used a scribe to mark the contours, then an axe and chisel to cut the half-moon shapes that would allow the logs to lock together. She was building only one wall, the front facade of her cabin, which would span the 20-foot opening of the cave. The sides of her structure were the unyielding granite walls of the cliff itself. She laid the first log, the sill, on a foundation of flat stones. Raising the subsequent logs was the crux of the entire project. She built 2 timber A-frames, one on each side of the opening. Using her block and tackle rigged to the top of these frames, she could hoist a log, one end at a time, into place. It was terrifyingly unstable. More than once a log slipped, crashing down with a force that would have crushed her instantly had she been in its path. But she was patient. She checked every rope, every knot, every anchor point. Inch by agonizing inch, the wall grew. She left openings for a small window and a heavy door. The gaps between the logs she chinked not with moss and mud, which would shrink and fall out, but with a mixture of clay, sand, and dried grasses that she packed in tight, a technique described in her father's notes as being superior for its longevity and sealing properties. Finally, she had to build the roof. It was a simple shed roof sloping from the top of her timber wall back to the cliff face. She laid smaller logs as rafters, anchoring them into crevices in the rock with iron spikes her father had intended for a mining operation. Over the rafters, she laid a deck of thick planks, split from one of the larger pines, and on top of that, she applied the final crucial layer. She hauled buckets of earth up and laid a thick sod roof 6 inches deep. It would provide excellent insulation, absorb the rain, and in winter, the snow that fell upon it would become just one more layer of blanketing protection. By late September, as the aspens in the valley turned a brilliant, fleeting gold, the structure was complete. It was a strange hybrid, a wooden cabin face grafted onto a stone mountain. It looked both ancient and new. From a distance it was difficult to see, blending into the grays and browns of the cliff. Anja spent the next month preparing for the winter she knew was coming. She felled and bucked another 20 trees, splitting the wood and stacking it inside the dry part of the cave next to her living quarters. The Russian stove was designed for efficiency, but a Montana winter was long. She needed a massive supply. She hunted, taking 2 deer with her father's rifle, butchering them and smoking the meat. She gathered late-season berries and roots. Her home was not just a structure. It was a sealed system, a fortress against the cold. The first test came in mid-October. A cold snap sent temperatures plunging into the teens overnight. In the valley, the other homesteaders lit their first fires of the season. Anya, with a sense of ceremony, loaded her stove for its first real burn. She filled the firebox with dry split pine, laid kindling, and lit it. The draft was perfect. The fire roared to life, a contained fury within the brick chamber. She closed the heavy cast-iron door and watched through the small grate as the fire burned with incredible intensity. It was designed to burn hot and fast, consuming the fuel completely and leaving almost no smoke. After 90 minutes, the fire was reduced to a deep bed of glowing coals. Following the instructions, she sealed the firebox door and the chimney damper completely. There was no more smoke. The stove was now a sealed container of immense heat. She placed her hand on the stone exterior. It was barely warm. A flicker of doubt entered her mind. Had she done it wrong? Had the men been right? Was it all a colossal failure? But her father's notes had prepared her for this. The heat had to saturate the inner core first, then slowly migrate through the hundreds of pounds of surrounding masonry. It was a process that took hours. She busied herself with other tasks, forcing herself not to hover over the stove. 2 hours later, she touched it again. The stone was distinctly warm now, a pleasant, deep heat. 4 hours later, the entire 8-ton mass was radiating a steady, gentle warmth that filled the entire space. It wasn't the scorching, directional heat of a fireplace. It was an ambient, pervasive comfort. The temperature inside her cabin climbed to 65 degrees and held there. Outside, it was 15 degrees. She went to bed that night not under a mountain of pelts, but a single wool blanket, and slept in a warmth her father had never known in this land. The community remained skeptical. They saw the smoke from her chimney for a brief period in the morning, and then nothing for the rest of the day. "Her fire's gone out," Jed had said with a grim certainty. "She'll freeze in that rock pile." They didn't understand that the absence of smoke was the proof of its success. Winter arrived in earnest in November. The snows came, deep and heavy. The temperatures dropped. Anya's routine became simple. Each morning, she would open the stove, clear out the small amount of fine ash, and light a new, fast-burning fire. For 2 hours, the stove would charge. For the next 22, it would discharge its heat into her home. Her cabin remained a constant 70 degrees, even when the temperature outside fell to 10 below zero. Her single pane of glass never frosted over. The snow on her sod roof did not melt, a telltale sign that no heat was escaping upwards. On the roofs of the cabins in the valley, the snow directly over the houses was always melted away, a perfect silhouette of wasted energy. The mockery from the community had faded, replaced by a wary silence. Her survival through the early winter was an inconvenient fact that contradicted their certainty. Blackwood, in particular, found it galling. He had offered the girl a way out, the sensible path, and she had rejected it for this folly. He would pass by the base of the cliff on his trap lines and look up at the strange little cabin, a wooden scar on the face of the mountain, and feel a surge of irritation. It was an affront to his experience, to the proper way of doing things. He found himself hoping, in a dark corner of his mind, that she would be proven wrong. Then came the real test. In the 3rd week of January, the sky turned a strange milky gray. The air grew unnaturally still, and the temperature began to plummet with an alarming speed. Silas, the old trapper, saw it and knew. He had seen it twice before in his long life. He called it the winter of the blue snow. A vast Arctic high-pressure system had descended from the north, a dome of impossibly cold, dense air that would stall over the mountains for days or even weeks. By nightfall, the temperature was 20 below. The next morning, it was 35 below. The snow that began to fall was not in flakes, but in tiny, hard grains like sand. It was so cold and dry that it had a bluish tint in the pale, hazy sunlight. And the wind came. It was not a storm wind, but a steady, relentless river of air, pouring over the mountains from the north, finding every crack, every weakness. For the homesteaders, life became a singular, desperate battle. Their cabins, which had been adequate in a normal winter, began to fail. The chinking between the logs, shrunk by the intense cold, opened up hairline cracks that admitted knife blades of Arctic air. The roaring fires in their fireplaces created a powerful draft that sucked the cold in even faster. Frost formed on the nail heads inside the walls, tracing the path of the cold from the outside in. They were living inside refrigerators, burning wood as fast as they could chop it, and still the cold gained on them. In Blackwood's cabin, the situation was dire. The temperature in the main room hovered at 10 degrees above zero. His children, bundled so completely they could barely move, were pale and listless. His wife's face was etched with fear. The firewood, which he had thought would last until March, was disappearing at a terrifying rate. He had to venture out every few hours into the stupefying cold to buck more logs from the woodpile, a task that left him breathless and frostbitten for a reward that seemed to vanish up the chimney in minutes. The smoke from the chimney blew back into the house, stinging their eyes. The well froze solid. They had to melt snow for water, a process that consumed yet more precious firewood. They were trapped. On the 4th day of the cold snap, a full-blown blizzard descended, burying the valley in 3 feet of the fine blue-tinted snow. Visibility was zero. The world was reduced to a screaming vortex of white. Blackwood's younger son, Daniel, began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the sound of the wind. By evening, he was feverish. Pneumonia, the same killer that had taken Lars Eriksson. Blackwood looked at his son, his small face flushed with fever, but his hands and feet like ice, and felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He looked at his wife, her eyes wide with terror. He looked at the walls of his cabin, the cabin he had built with his own proud hands, and saw the feathery patterns of frost creeping across the logs. His expertise, his experience, his pride. It was all worthless. His cabin was a death trap. And then a thought, unwelcome and humiliating, pushed its way into his mind. The girl, the orphan in her cave. He had mocked her. He had pitied her. He had predicted her doom. But what if her folly was wisdom? What if her father's strange engineering was not madness? There was only one way to know. It was a desperate, impossible gamble. The journey was only 4 miles, but in this blizzard, at this temperature, it might as well have been 100. Leaving his family was unthinkable, but staying was a death sentence. His wife saw the resolve harden in his face. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "I'm going to the Eriksson girl," he said, his voice hoarse. "If her place is warm, I'm bringing you and the children there." She didn't argue. There were no other options left. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and fur he possessed, leaving little for the others. He took a small axe and a half-full flask of whiskey. Kissing his wife and children felt like a final farewell. The moment he opened the door, the storm punched him in the face. The wind tore the breath from his lungs. The cold was a physical blow, a stunning, malevolent force. He could not see more than 5 feet in front of him. He navigated by instinct, by the feel of the land under his feet, by the direction of the wind on his face. The snow was not soft powder. It was a granular, abrasive tide that he had to wade through, each step a monumental effort. After what felt like an eternity, his lungs burning, his beard a solid mass of ice, he saw it, a faint, rectangular patch of orange light high up on the cliff face. It was her window. It was real. The sight gave him a surge of adrenaline. He scrambled up the scree slope, his legs screaming in protest. The last 50 yards, he was on his hands and knees, the wind threatening to peel him off the side of the mountain. He was not walking, he was crawling, crawling for warmth, crawling for his son's life, crawling to the door of the girl he had dismissed as a fool. He reached the heavy wooden door and hammered on it with a numb fist. For a moment, there was no response. He slumped against the wood, his energy gone, a terrifying blackness creeping into the edges of his vision. Then he heard the sound of a heavy bar being lifted. The door swung inward. The warmth that hit him was not a blast of heat. It was a physical presence, a solid wall of stable, profound comfort. It was like diving into a summer lake. And there stood Anya, holding a lantern, her face calm, her dog standing silently beside her. She looked at the pathetic, ice-encrusted man collapsed on her doorstep, the great Thomas Blackwood, and her expression did not change. There was no triumph, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, solemn acceptance. "My son," Blackwood croaked, the words tearing at his frozen throat. "He's sick. Your cabin, it's warm." "Yes," she said simply. "It is warm. Bring them here." He did. It took him 2 trips, 2 more descents into that white hell, but he brought them. He carried his feverish son wrapped in their last dry blanket, while his wife struggled behind him with their daughter. When they were all finally inside, the door barred against the storm, the contrast was absolute. Outside, a world of screaming chaos and killing cold. Inside, a bubble of stillness and life-giving warmth. The air was fresh, not smoky. The radiant heat from the massive stone stove filled every corner of the room. Blackwood's son, Daniel, stopped shivering for the first time in days. Mrs. Blackwood simply wept, tears of relief freezing on her cheeks before melting in the gentle heat. They were not the last to arrive. The next morning, the blizzard still raging, Jed appeared, half frozen, his wife and infant daughter in tow. His cabin's chimney had become blocked with snow, filling the room with smoke. They had been forced to put out their fire. Anya took them in. By the end of the day, her small single-room cabin held 11 people. It was crowded, but it was warm. It was life. The adults, the experienced homesteaders, sat in humbled silence, watching the 16-year-old girl they had mocked move about her space with quiet efficiency. They watched her check the kettle, portion out some of her smoked venison and dried apples for a communal meal, and calmly read from her father's notebooks. She held all the power of life and death, and she wielded it with a quiet grace that was more shaming than any rebuke. When the blizzard finally broke after 6 days, the world was transformed and silent, buried under an immense blanket of white. The temperature remained brutally low, but the wind was gone. The survivors in Anya's cliffside ark emerged into a landscape of stark, frozen beauty. The toll in the valley had been heavy. 2 homesteaders who lived on the far side, an elderly couple, were found frozen in their cabin. Dozens of livestock had perished. Every single one of the conventional cabins had failed in some way. In the weeks that followed, as the community slowly recovered, a profound shift occurred. The hierarchy of knowledge had been inverted. The men, led by a deeply humbled Thomas Blackwood, came to Anya not with advice, but with questions. They did not come to her cabin to offer help. They came to ask for it. Blackwood, his son now fully recovered, sat at her table, the same table where she had studied her father's plans, and asked her to explain the principles of the stove. "Show me," he said, his voice stripped of its former arrogance. "Show me the drawings." Anya shared her father's notebooks freely. She explained the concept of thermal mass, of forcing the hot gases through a long path to surrender their heat. She pointed to the cross-section diagrams, her finger tracing the labyrinthine flue channels. She explained why her sod roof, covered in a thick blanket of insulating snow, was superior to their timber roofs that bled heat into the sky. She took them outside and showed them how the cabin was sealed to the rock, how the mountain itself was part of the heating system. She was no longer the grieving orphan girl. She was the engineer. The men listened, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. They had been trying to defeat the winter with brute force, with bigger fires. Anya had shown them how to co-opt the very earth itself, to make an ally of the stone and a servant of the fire. That spring, there was a different kind of building in the valley. Using Lars Eriksson's notebooks as their guide and Anya as their consultant, the homesteaders began retrofitting their cabins. Blackwood, with Anya's help, built a massive masonry heater in the center of his own home, a smaller version of hers. Others began to bank their north-facing walls with earth and stone, creating earth-bermed structures that mimic the principle of her cliff dwelling. The phrase, the Eriksson method, entered the local vernacular. What had been dismissed as a child's folly had become the new standard for survival. Years passed. The community grew, but it grew differently. The new cabins that were built were smarter, more efficient, designed in harmony with the harsh realities of the land. Anya never left her home in the cliff. It remained a place of quiet warmth, a testament to a father's knowledge and a daughter's resolve. She was no longer an outsider. She was the foundation. Travelers passing through would hear the story of the winter of the blue snow, of how the valley's inhabitants had been saved by a young girl who built her house into a mountain. They would look up at the widow's tooth, at the single clear pane of glass glinting in the sun, and they would see not a strange folly, but a monument. It was a monument not to one person, but to an idea, that the most challenging problems are sometimes solved not with more force, but with a deeper understanding, and that wisdom has no regard for age or station. It belongs to those who are willing to see the world not just for what it is, but for what it could be.